This is the final render I came up with for the scene, and I did make a few changes just here and there, little tweaks. I created another version too, just exporting or saving out the Z-depth along with the color image, and coming up with a slightly different post version. And this is with just a little bit of post in Photoshop, just some slight color adjustments. Really wanted to just make the colors more vibrant, a little more intense. Also adjusting kind of the color of the haze, which I used or created with the aerial perspective. I also applied a few glow filters and some depth of field type blurs using the Z-depth as a mask. But for the most part, it's still pretty similar to the original output from View. So I just want to show you a couple of things in View and really just kind of show some of the major impacting factors of the way the lighting turned out and the overall contrast of the scene. If I open up or double click on the main camera, we take a look at the settings. I have my display gamma at 1.2, and then my input for the texture maps is set to 1.8. And then in the atmosphere editor, sky fog and haze tab, I have my aerial perspective set to 20 in order to give that sort of dense fog towards the back of the forest. Reduced my ambient light color a little bit, and I also ended up rendering it out with a quality boost of -1.6 because I was using radiosity, and it saved me a little more than an hour on the render time. And the quality was reduced because of that, but it's really nothing I wasn't able to take care of in Photoshop and a little bit of post. The render settings, using custom render settings. So going to the anti-aliasing, I ended up with, for the object anti-aliasing, just 4 and 16, so basically default. And then for the texture anti-aliasing, I just used 4 and 8. For the shadows in the scene, if we open up and double click on the sunlight, I ended up using a shadow map, using the auto size quality with a ratio of 6. So that gave me some nice soft shadows overall, but still a good outline of some of the major features. But I mostly was in ambient light, so I didn't need some of the brighter patches that would show up with ray tracing. So I also want to show another method, really useful technique that would have come in handy earlier, but because of the way I had used the terrain and applied ecosystems, and also because I wasn't quite sure where I was really going with the scene. The final output I hadn't entirely had in mind, so even though I'm only using a very reduced portion of the terrain, the rest of it is still in the scene. Because I did want to have it there in case I decided to change the shot a little bit. But if you have something a little bit more planned out, and the camera pretty much stayed in the same place the whole time, I want to show you a way we can extract just this area of the terrain to make the scene itself a lot easier to work with. So I'm going to go back to a previous version of the scene where we just have the terrain, not even converted to the procedural yet, so without the ecosystem as well. So I've loaded in the forest B01, which is the point just before ecosystems were added in. So it's just the terrain, the material, or the early stages of the material. But if we take a look up in the top view, it is a little difficult to see because of the the coloration of the terrain, but really only a very small portion of it is being used. A lot of it isn't needed for what we ended up in the final shot. And because of that, earlier did make it more difficult to paint the material for the path because we were painting on such a small area with a pretty minimal size texture. And I did want to keep the overall resolution of the terrain down. So I'm going to show you what you can do to really improve these closer, more focused areas. So I'm going to start by editing the object. And once again, we still have that material map applied that I edited externally. So I'm going to click No. I don't want to resample it. And if we take a look at the area, just shift and double click to show that path. We really only have this very small section of the terrain being used. So what we can do is first what we need to apply. And I don't have the procedural added. This is still a standard terrain, so we are going to convert it over to a procedural terrain from a standard. That will give us access to the zone control. So we can switch over to zones. And I'm going to click Add. So what we can do is now add in a zone. And it's giving us a display of the scene. So we can see where the camera is at, where our path is. And what we can do is just cut out that portion of the terrain just by clicking and highlighting out a box to create a zone out of. And if you want to create or add some area behind the terrain to make sure that you get certain shadows casting depending where the light's coming from, then you will want to add a little bit of additional area. So now we have a separated zone for just this area of focus. What we can also do is extract this. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, just to sort of preserve that zone at the moment. Go back, edit the object, and then select that zone and go to Extract. Now it's going to ask me if I'd like to create a hole in the current terrain where this section used to be, basically to cut them out and make them overlap a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and select Yes. So now it's showing where that zone would be, although it is extracted. If we go to the entire terrain zone, so seeing the entire terrain, we'll see that area that was cut out. Go ahead and click OK, and now we have two terrains in the scene. One being that zone, so now called Procedural Terrain 3, and the Procedural Terrain 2, which was the original and still exists in the scene, and does have the hole cut out with this portion in it. Now this is really beneficial, and what I'm going to do is just select No again for that texture map, but opening the zone based terrain. The overall texture size or size of the terrain is 1024 by 993, so pretty close to the original size of the other terrain, which means our texture map is now condensed into this area and the only real area that we're seeing in the shot. So I just want to show you, I'm going to just add a new layer to use as a path, add a new material layer. I'm just going to select brown sand and switch over to the material painting. Change the color of that gray rock just to make it separated. So now with the brown sand selected, we can really easily paint in, get a nice defined texture and material distribution, because we have a lot more image to work with. So we'll be able to get a much smoother output and have a lot more control over the detail. So this becomes a much better method, really depending on which stage you're working at. Before it was more difficult because I wanted to preserve certain parts of the ecosystem and really kind of show you different types of workflow. And once again, it was because, I did want to leave the rest of the terrain there because I wasn't quite sure exactly what my final output was going to be. But once we reach a stage where we have a fixed camera, we know what's in the view, it's very easy to cut it out and just use what we need. Now another thing is I want to go back and I'm going to delete that zone, delete the object. I'm also going to go into the procedural, and we have this zone hole that is being created from where we created the zone. I'm going to delete those nodes, click OK, to bring this back to where it was before. Going back to that zone, which is still here, before I extract it, I do want to increase the quality of the other terrain, because as you saw before, it was very pixelated. There wasn't enough information. So we could, if we have a procedural added to it first, it does make it a little easier, but since it is coming from a standard terrain, it is a better idea to increase the resolution first. If needed, possibly apply a little bit of an effect just to get some detail. Diffusive erosion works pretty well to smooth out some of the edges. Thermal also works really well. Diffuse is also one of the faster methods. So now going back to the zone, we can select it and extract. And just doing the same thing again. And now we can downsize that other terrain. So going to what's now called procedural terrain 4, edit the object. And once we reduce the resolution back down to really kind of where we need it, it does look a bit better. We could also go over to the effects and kind of diffuse it a little bit more if needed. Get rid of some of that pixelation. But for the most part, once the procedural was added, it took care of most of that. But now we have something where we can work with a texture map that is much larger. And that's going to fit the terrain and the area of the scene that we're really working on. You could continue on and cut out pieces closer and closer to the camera in order to get more and more detail within those areas. I do want to note that if you are going to be using both terrains, and I'm just going to go ahead and pull out the camera. Now the overlapping we're seeing is just OpenGL a difference. It's really not a difference in the terrains. They're actually lined up perfectly. If we rendered it, we wouldn't see any lines showing. Okay, go ahead and do a quick just area render. Now because we have a standard terrain extraction with a different scale, in this case the line is showing slightly. And that's because I ran some filters on it. If I would have left it the same without applying any effects, then it would match up really well. More so if the original terrain was a procedural. In this case, we had a standard, so you might have to play with it a little bit more. But what I want to mention is that in order to get the scales of the materials to match correctly, you do need to be working with world standard mapping modes. If you're in a parametric mode, the scale will link to the size of the new object, and then the materials won't match anymore because the unit systems will be off. So just one thing to pay attention to is making sure that you have the same mapping world standard on both. Using parametric modes is possible, but it requires a lot more setup time. It's easier just to use a world standard and rescale the overall size of the material if needed, if you were using a parametric material. So there are definitely other ways to be able to reduce the scene, increase quality, and gain more control over everything. And I just thought that this was something that needed to be shown, and that way you'll be able to use these features, because the zones and being able to extract them as of version 9 is just immensely useful. And I just want to make one last note, and that is about the content that is included with the training. Unfortunately, all of these scenes and the different steps I won't be able to provide, because the file sizes are nearing around a gig for everything, all the different scene files, mainly with a large increase in the file size once ecosystems were added. So because of that, I'm not going to be able to provide every single step for the ecosystems, and you may also find that I've used the zone technique in order to kind of crop out some of the instances and detail from the scene that isn't being used, in order to reduce the file size for the content. You'll also find that the texture maps used from the Leaves collection will be reduced in their size, because the Leaves collection, the quality of a lot of the maps are really quite large, and the file sizes because of that can be a little bit bigger. So I might resample those and downscale them for the provided content. So you may find a slight quality difference, but for the most part, in the way they were used in the scene, you should be able to produce the same results, no problem.